Those of us that love chess have been very fortunate that Magnus is playing in everything in sight, but now he is in one of the absolute major tournaments of the year, the Tata Steel Masters 2023. He had a draw in his first round. Today we're going to go over his second round game against Vincent Keymer. Magnus is 28.59 in this game. Vincent Keymer was 26.96. And going into this tournament, Magnus said that his goal of reaching a rating of 2,900 was going to have to be put aside a little bit. He knew that in a tournament of this strength, it's very hard to raise your rating. His main goal is to win it. So let's jump right in. Magnus has black. Vincent Keymer has white. He begins with d4. Magnus plays knight f6. And very quickly, Magnus plays the Grunfeld defense. The idea is to allow white to build a nice big fat pawn center, but then black attacks it with everything he's got. A main line is to just take here e4, knight c3, bc3, and bishop g7. Black has the bishop pressuring. I play c5, knight c6, maybe even f5 later. But Keymer instead plays the move knight to f3, a little more positional, not quite as sharp as the main line. A bishop to g7 and bishop to g5, knight to e4. Obviously, that's putting pressure on the knight and the bishop. One of the lines here is actually to take on d5, and after knight takes, then e6, which attacks the knight, and when the knight moves, ed5. And what you have here is a classic Carlsbad structure. This is one of the more simpler ways that the position can be played, but to keep it complex, Keymer plays bishop to f4, keeping those pieces on the board. Magnus takes on c3, bc3, and again, the main move here is c5. That's a very classic Grunfeld move. Even if you give up a pawn in the short term, you want to open up that long diagonal, but Magnus plays c6. He doesn't want the game to be resolved in the opening, and in order to keep it in the middle game, he does get maybe not the best position. It's not a bad position, but it's definitely not. White does well here in the opening, e3, and castles. And Keymer can be very happy with the opening position. He has a lot of central control here. Queen to b3, putting pressure on d5 and the b7 pawn. Queen to a5, putting pressure on c3. Bishop to e2, pawn takes, and bishop takes c4. And you see here, white has a very nice center. The bishops, they look well posted, but they don't really work together so well, at least not at the moment. Knight to d7. In a structure like this, black's main pawn break will be either c5 or e5 if he can get it through. Bishop g5. Now, this is actually a novelty. Castling have been played in the past in this position, but bishop g5 is played by Keymer, attacking the e7 pawn directly. b5 hits the bishop to e2, and you see Magnus trying to lay claim to those light squares in the center. Rook to e8, potentially setting up a pawn break on e5, but more importantly in the short term, just defending the e7 pawn. Castling and knight to b6, so the knight's no longer supporting e5, but it is putting pressure on c4 and d5. e4, getting a full pawn center. Bishop to e6, continuing that pressure on the light squares and really aiming at c4. Queen to c2, and now c5. So he still has to play a pawn break to help weaken white's center, and obviously he's going to play c5. He can't even play e5 at all right now. The bishop's blocking it. And here, taking the pawn would just be a mistake. You get pawn weaknesses, and after knight to a4, everything's piling on c3. The knight also attacks c5. That would be a bad move. So Keymer advances in the center, d5, and he does gain space. The only downside, though, is that this bishop on g7 has had the diagonal cleared, so that's something for black to be happy about. Bishop to g4, the bishop retreats to d2 to help defend the c3 pawn. e6 is played. Magnus wants to dissolve this nice space advantage. You don't want to leave white with a pawn wedge on d5 like that. Rook a to b1, attacks b5, also steps out of the threat of the bishop from g7. c4, blocks the bishop's attack on b5. d6, rook e6, knight to d4, light squared bishops come off, and a6. So we can make an assessment here, and Magnus's queenside pawns are very strong. Obviously, Keymer has weaknesses at c3 and a2. And this is a very impressive pawn chain, and Magnus has a lot of pressure on c3. If c3 falls, white's going to be in pretty big trouble. Knight to d4 hits the rook retreats, rook f to e1, knight to a4, continuing to pile on the c3 pawn, knight to c6 hits the queen comes back to c7, now knight to b4. This knight can reroute itself to d5, knight c5, attacks e4, and maybe he'll drop into d3 if it becomes a possibility. Now knight to d5, which hits the queen, but now queen to c6, and here white plays bishop to g5, and this is probably a mistake. You'll notice this knight on d5 is well placed, but it's not well supported. He's only got one pawn protecting it, and that pawn is under quite a bit of pressure, and the queen is putting pressure on the knight. So because of that, Magnus decides to play a combination, and the transpose, it doesn't win any material, but it's a really powerful positional concept. First, he takes the pawn at e4. That removes the defender of the knight. So before just retaking the knight, he plays knight to e7, check, right? So that forks the king and the queen. Basically, black has to take the knight with the rook. Bishop takes e7, and now knight to c3. So he's gotten the e4 and c3 pawn for the rook. So Magnus has won a knight and two pawns in exchange for a rook. Now that's even material. However, the problem for Vincent Keymer is that these three pawns are now monsters, and they're assisted by this Grunfeld bishop on g7. This is a really hard position for white. Even though material is equal, he's really up against it. Rook to c1, the rook was under attack. a5, the pawns begin to march. Bishop to g5, bringing the bishop back for defense. b4, bishop to d2, rook to d8. And taking the knight wouldn't really make much of a difference. The bishop would just take, and he's still doing very well. h4, perhaps trying to gain some counterplay on the king side. h5 would have been a reasonable response here from black, but instead he plays rook to d3, h5, and now Magnus just goes ahead and takes the pawn. He says, yeah, it's breaking up my pawn structure, but it's a free pawn, and I have so much control on the queen side, it's not going to matter. Bishop does take the bishop. Bishop takes bishop. Queen to e2. Queen to d5. And queen to e8 check. By the way, this bishop is worth more than the rook at e1, really. Queen to d5. Queen e8 check. King g7. And now rook to e3. He'd like to shift the rook over to attack. The problem is, of course, that this rook at d3 would mirror the rook, and he's not able to get anywhere with the check at the moment. Magnus plays h6. The queen comes back to e4, and computers like for black to play queen to g5 here, keeping the queens on the board and making it hard for white to move. But Magnus says, I have a chance to transpose into a better endgame. I'm the master of endgames. I'm going to take it. So he goes ahead and exchanges queens. And now b3. What Magnus is doing is he's basically forcing a transposition into a rook versus rook endgame where he has an advantage. There's really nothing white can do to stop it. So rook takes c4, pawn takes pawn, rook to a4, promotes to a queen, which is defended by the bishop, so he has to give the rook up. Bishop takes, rook takes a1, and then rook to d5 to defend the a5 pawn. So here we have our basic rook endgame. And Magnus is up two pawns. It is true that his kingside pawns are a fright. They're not very well placed, but it's not as big a problem because he's got this passed a pawn, and he can use that to divert white from getting anywhere on the king side. Rook to a4, blockading that pawn, king to f6, king to f1, king to e6. In a perfect world, he would just be able to march his king to b5, but Keymer is not going to let it be that easy. King to e2, rook f5, king d6. Now rook to c4, cutting off the king so it can't cross over. Rook to c5, challenging that rook. Rook to f4, attacking the pawn at f7. Rook to e5, check. Now king over to defend that pawn. Rook to a4 again. He wants to create a wall here that Magnus can't cross. King f6, rook to f4, check. Rook to g5, attacking the pawn on g2. Rook to a2, defends. Rook to e5. Again, you see these rooks want to keep these kings as inactive as possible. They want to keep the kings from crossing these lines. Rook to a4, f6, g3, rook to g5. attacking this pawn, and this pawn is very hard, if not impossible, to defend. King to e3, and so Magnus makes a key decision. He decides to take on g3, which means he's giving up his a5 pawn, but he's saying, I'm in such good shape over here that it's going to be really hard for white to stop my h-pawn. h4, he begins to march. Rook to a8 with a little trap. If Magnus were to just advance his pawn, he'd actually lose, because Vincent Keymer would check from behind and win the rook. So to keep that from happening, he plays the king to h5 to get out of that check. King to f2, and again, he can't advance the pawn because he just lose the rook. So the rook retreats to g6, again, controlling that line so the king cannot cross, keeping it away from the passed pawn at h4. Rook to a5 check, rook to g5, rook to a3, h3. Now f4. He attacks the rook, and he attacks the pawn at h3. But then rook to g2 check. And in this position, Vincent Keymer resigned, and Magnus got his first win at the 2023 Tata Steel Masters. The idea is after the king moves, just king to h4, and there's really nothing to be done. This is an easily winning endgame at this point for, he can come here, he can go ahead and move over and take the f-pawn at some point. It's over. And so Magnus has his first win at the Tata Steel Masters, and I'm looking forward to his performance in the rest of this tournament. I know you are too. By the way, if you're enjoying these videos, be sure to hit the subscribe button. And if you want to see another great game from Magnus, be sure to click on this video right here. I'm confident you're going to enjoy it. See you again soon.